Introduction. Hello, today, I will explain about the dual voice broadcast. The dual voice broadcast refers to the broadcast on August 15, 1945 at noon, when Emperor Showa, known as Hirohito, personally announced the end of the war to the nation on the radio. The emperor's voice was reverently called the dual voice, and since it was broadcast on the radio, it was called the dual voice broadcast. Through this broadcast, the nation learned that they had lost the Asia-Pacific War, and August 15th became remembered as the anniversary of the end of the war in Japan. The Asia-Pacific War was a war that occurred during World War II. In World War II, which began in 1939, Japan declared war and began fighting in 1941 with the landing operation on the British Malay Peninsula and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Initially, Japan made a swift advance, but after the defeat in the Battle of Midway, they switched to a defensive stance. Then, in 1945, after being defeated and occupied in the battles of Saipan and Iwo Jima, the US military became able to conduct air raids throughout Japan, and Japan began to suffer air raids on the mainland. Subsequently, in April, the Allied forces began landing on the main island of Okinawa. After occupying Okinawa in June, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration in July, demanding Japan's surrender, which Japan ignored. In August, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As a result, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration, and the Asia-Pacific War ended with Japan's defeat. The dual voice broadcast takes place just before the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. On August 14, 1945, Japan decided to accept the Potsdam Declaration through the Imperial Conference, a meeting attended by the Emperor. In other words, they decided to surrender to the Allied powers. The Emperor deciding the fate of the nation by his own will was an exceptional event at the time. Outside of Japan, some people may perceive the Emperor at that time as an absolute figure worshipped as a god, but the reality was quite different. It is true that he was revered by the people, but legally, although he was said to have most of the powers in the state, these rights were to be exercised under the advice of the ministers of state, and the emperor had almost no authority that he could exercise independently. This is because when Japan modernized, it introduced a constitutional monarchy modeled after the United Kingdom, and at the same time, it accepted the idea that the king reigns but does not govern. The emperor could do little other than diplomacy, such as approving ministers of state and military ministers. In other words, the emperor could no longer endure the repeated rampages of the military, the expansion of the front lines, and the sacrifices of the people, so he broke with precedent and forcefully decided to surrender. Now, having decided to surrender was all well and good, but the problem was how to inform the nation that they had surrendered. At the suggestion of Shimamura Hiroshi, the head of the Information Bureau, an organization that carried out information propaganda and thought control at the time, it was decided that the emperor would make a direct appeal through a radio broadcast. Until then, the emperor had never appeared on the radio. Therefore, most of the people had never heard the emperor's voice. This illustrates that there was no way to convey the fact of the defeat to the nation other than in the form of an exceptional radio message. At this time, what the emperor read was a document called the Imperial Rescript on the termination of the Greater East Asia War. The Greater East Asia War was the term used at the time to refer to the Asia-Pacific War. An imperial rescript means an official document issued by the emperor. The content was about the announcement of the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and the reasons for it. In short, the war situation was not necessarily improving, and the enemy was even using a new type of bomb, the atomic bomb, so if the war continued any longer, not only Japan but also the civilization of the world would be destroyed. Therefore, although Japan would face a difficult path, it had no choice but to surrender. At 11:25 p.m., Emperor Showa arrived at the Imperial Household Agency's Inner Court Agency Political Affairs Room, dressed in an army military uniform. The recording took place here. Standing in front of a stand microphone, Emperor Showa read the Imperial Rescript. However, he said, "My voice was too low just now," and demanded a retake. Due to the unexpected NG, no good, by the emperor himself, a second recording was made. Emperor Showa seemed unsatisfied with this as well and suggested a third recording, but it was decided that this was too much, and the recording was cut off. Therefore, there are two master records of the emperor's voice. After the recording work was finished and they left the Imperial Household Agency, Shimamura Hiroshi and the recording team from the Broadcasting Corporation, NHK, were detained by Captain Sato Yoshihiro, commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Imperial Guard Infantry Regiment. There were forces within the military that opposed the surrender and resorted to force to stop the broadcast. They also tried to occupy the Imperial Palace and the Broadcasting Corporation, and the situation could have turned into a large-scale coup d'état. However, by early morning, the coup was suppressed and ended in failure. And the dual-voice broadcast was broadcast as scheduled. Then, at noon on August 15th, the dual-voice broadcast was aired on radios throughout Japan. At that time, there was only one radio station, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation, so almost all of the nation heard the same broadcast. However, the dual-voice broadcast was in a difficult classical Chinese style, and the emperor's reading had a unique tempo, so many people reportedly could not understand the content. Afterward, explanations by announcers were aired, and the detailed content was also written in newspapers delivered in the afternoon, and it seems that many people learned of Japan's defeat there. Incidentally, there is a famous photograph of the nation breaking down in tears upon hearing the dual-voice broadcast, which was also published in Japanese textbooks and other materials, but it has recently been revealed that this photograph was likely a staged photograph taken the day before. Now, let's look at the full text of the broadcast that was actually aired.
I have deeply considered the state of the world and the current situation of Japan, and I have decided to take extraordinary measures to resolve this crisis. I am informing you, my loyal subjects, of this decision. I have instructed the imperial government to inform the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that we will accept the joint declaration, Potsdam Declaration. The principle that the people of the empire should live in peace and harmony, sharing prosperity and joy with the world, is a teaching passed down by successive emperors and one that I have not neglected. We declared war on the United States and Great Britain to ensure the empire's independence and the stability of East Asia. It was never my intention to infringe upon the sovereignty of other nations or to invade their territories. However, the war has continued for 4 years, and despite the bravery of my army and navy, the diligent efforts of many government officials, and the devotion of my 100 million subjects who have given their best, the war situation has not improved, and the world situation is unfavorable to us. Moreover, the enemy has begun to use a new and most cruel bomb, killing and injuring many innocent people, and the extent of the damage is unimaginable. To continue the war would only lead to the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation and result in the total destruction of human civilization. How can I protect the lives of you, my beloved subjects, and how can I apologize to the spirits of my imperial ancestors if such a fate befalls us? This is the reason why I have instructed the government to accept the joint declaration. I express my sincere regret to our allies who have cooperated with Japan in the liberation of East Asia. Thinking of those who have died in the war, those who have perished in their duties, and their bereaved families fills me with deep sorrow. I also feel profound pain for those who have been wounded in the war, those who have lost their homes and livelihoods. The hardships that the Empire of Japan will face from now on will be severe. I understand well the feelings of all my subjects. However, I have resolved to endure the unbearable and suffer the insufferable so that future generations may enjoy peace. I will protect the national polity, and I trust in the sincerity of you, my loyal subjects. I am always with you. Should you act on emotions, cause incidents, harm your fellow countrymen, or disrupt social order, you would stray from the right path and lose the world's trust. This is something I strictly admonish against. We must unite as one family, pass on our heritage to our descendants, and believe in the immortality of our divine nation, Japan. We must bear the heavy responsibilities we shoulder, remain steadfast, and dedicate our full efforts to future reconstruction. We must value ethics, uphold our ideals, and ensure that the essence of our national polity shines brightly, keeping pace with the progress and development of the world. You, my subjects, should understand that this is my will and act accordingly.
At this time, what pained Emperor Showa was the fact that those who had been his subjects would be tried as war criminals. It is said that Emperor Showa confided to Minister of the Interior Kido, "Can't I take all the responsibility myself, even if it means abdicating, and settle this?" On August 30th, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers Douglas MacArthur arrived in Atsugi. 3 days later, on September 2nd, the surrender ceremony was held aboard the battleship USS Missouri, which had entered Tokyo Bay. General MacArthur notified the Japanese government that henceforth, the General Headquarters of the Allied Powers, GHQ, would formulate policies. The GHQ moved its headquarters next to the Imperial Palace, and on September 11th, without prior notice, it arrested and detained 37 people, including former Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, as war criminals. The day before, a resolution to try Emperor Showa as a war criminal had been submitted to the U.S. Congress. A little while later, Yoshida Shigeru, who had newly become foreign minister, was summoned by Emperor Showa to the palace and was told of his intention to meet with General MacArthur. On September 20th, Yoshida conveyed the emperor's intention to General MacArthur. General MacArthur said that he thought it would be good for him to meet with the emperor, but that nothing should be done to hurt the emperor's self-respect or cause him trouble, and he proposed a meeting at the U.S. ambassador's residence. On September 27th at 10 a.m., a car carrying Emperor Showa, dressed in a silk hat and mourning attire, passed through the gate of the U.S. ambassador's residence. Of course, this was not just an ordinary meeting. His close aides were worried about the emperor's life, and the emperor himself was aware that the fate of the Japanese people and the imperial family rested on him. General MacArthur was not present at the entrance of the residence, and 2 aides greeted them. General MacArthur received the emperor in the reception room and led him to a room in the back. Before the meeting began, photographs were taken, and then the meeting between the two began. There is no official record of what kind of conversation took place there. However, General MacArthur wrote the following in his memoir.
"This is what the Emperor said: I am the only person who should bear responsibility for all the decisions and actions taken by the Japanese people in the political and military spheres in the conduct of the war. I have come here to entrust myself to the judgment of the Allied powers you represent." A great emotion shook me. I was deeply moved by his attitude of willingly taking on responsibility that could result in death, responsibility that clearly should not be attributed to the emperor, as far as I knew. I thought that the emperor in front of me was not only the highest gentleman in Japan but also a great human being.
The meeting was originally scheduled for 15 minutes but lasted for 35 minutes, and after the meeting, General MacArthur's attitude toward the emperor had completely changed. Moved, he changed his plans and went out to the entrance to see Emperor Showa off. This was probably a manifestation of General MacArthur's utmost goodwill. Later, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East was held, but despite strong demands from his home country, General MacArthur did not execute the emperor. To understand the state of mind of ordinary people at the end of the war, let's look at the diaries of people from various walks of life. In the photos and explanations found in textbooks and other materials, scenes of people rejoicing or breaking down in tears upon hearing the dual-voice broadcast are impressive, but the actual reactions of ordinary people were not uniform. The first diary introduced is that of a 14-year-old boy who was attending middle school at the time. The boy could not believe Japan's defeat, thinking,
"There are still so many troops and weapons, and even if the Yamato people were to perish, it would be better to be praised by the people of the world for fighting to the last man than to make a shameful surrender." He felt that the adults around him, who were lamenting, were only unable to speak their true feelings because of the presence of the military police, and that they might actually be feeling relieved.
As a pure-hearted young boy who had been raised according to the teachings of his school and family, he believed that Japan could not possibly lose. Next is the diary of a girl who was in the 6th grade of elementary school at the end of the war. The girl frankly wrote,
"I wondered if I wouldn't have to go to school anymore,"
indicating that she was dissatisfied with the government's response up to that point. She criticized Tojo Hideki, saying,
"The government lied to the people, saying that American laws had sunk many warships, while making Japanese war laws bigger."
Despite being only 12 years old, she may have had quite accurate information about the fact that Japan was actually at a disadvantage and the realities of the Tojo cabinet. The third diary is that of a man in his 40s, who was living in Brazil at the end of the war. He had emigrated from Japan to Brazil in 1931 and was living in Sao Paulo while running a business. His diary states,
"There is still no confirmation from Japan, but I cannot even dream of surrendering now that Russia's diplomacy and one or two of Ponda's new bombs have dropped, even if I resolve to do so to the last man."
His sentiment of not wanting to accept Japan's surrender comes through. As written,
"No matter what Brazilian newspaper it is, it will not be able to reconcile the many major problems that will arise in an instant with Japan's surrender in the face of such a major world event."
There seems to have been a group among the Japanese immigrants in Brazil who believed that Japan could not possibly lose and could not accept reality. Perhaps they were only saying good things as if it was someone else's problem, since they had not actually experienced the war. Finally, there is a record of a writer close to the government. He belonged to the Japanese Literature Patriotic Association, an external organization of the Cabinet Information Bureau, and was engaged in various writing activities. From his diary on the day the war ended, it is clear that he was calmly observing the reactions of the people around him. From a conversation with a sergeant that he happened to overhear on a train, he could sense the sentiment of being unable to accept surrender, as the sergeant said in a voice that sounded as if he were clenching his fists.
"Something will happen, something will surely happen, and the enemy will be drawn to the water's edge, and then they will be struck with a bang. Surely that's what will happen."
He also wrote that many people were dejected by the sudden defeat, and he heard many voices saying,
"I hate to lose like this, I wish the war would continue.
And,
If we continue, there's no way we can lose."
he analyzes this as evidence that the government's propaganda of preserving kamikaze planes, decisive battle on the mainland, and corruption had penetrated well among the people. The people were also unaware of the power of the atomic bomb, as the truth had been concealed. At that time, within Japan, more than 800,000 civilians were recorded as having died in air raids, and the number is immeasurable if those who starved to death are included. For the sake of propaganda and information control, the Japanese military justified forced labor both within and outside of Japan, claiming that Japan was fighting for justice and that any sacrifice was unavoidable for that cause. Of course, there were those who purely believed in Japan's justice and victory, like the 14-year-old boy introduced, but not everyone was like that. There were also those who saw through the truth under the information control, like the girl who criticized Tojo Hideki. The Japanese people were not uniformly saddened upon hearing the dual-voice broadcast. Their perceptions varied depending on their respective positions and circumstances. What they had in common was that they were more concerned about their future lives than about the relief of the war's end. It may have been only natural that their primary concern was for themselves and their families, as they were in a state where even their daily lives were barely manageable. These diaries can be said to be valuable records that allow us to know the state of mind of ordinary people at a major turning point in Japan's history, the end of the war. Conclusion. Just as the people of the Allied nations were fighting for justice, Japan was also fighting for what it believed to be its own justice. The Japanese people upheld the justice of liberating Asia from colonization as the leader of Asia, and while driving their own people into forced labor and starvation, they engaged in the foolish act of expanding the front lines. At first, the Japanese military invested in and developed the areas it controlled, but as the front lines expanded, it could not maintain that system. In the end, it dragged them into the war and requisitioned labor and food, resulting in an estimated 20 million deaths in Asia. This concludes today's video. In this video, we conveyed the situation at that time through the dual voice broadcast. This is a compilation of facts based on Japanese sources, but I would be happy if you do not take this information at face value and investigate more deeply from your own perspective. Finally, I will conclude by expressing my personal opinions and impressions. Those who have interacted with Japanese people will understand that most Japanese people stubbornly refuse to admit that they belong to a religious organization, even though they engage in religious behavior. Also, when asked what their justice or beliefs are, some people even say they have none. Those who have seen Japanese anime and movies will find that there are many stories where those who claim justice suffer painful experiences. This is also a result of regretting and reflecting on the fact that in the past, they fought wars of justice through military expansion and invasion, and were crushed. From past history, I also believe that it is foolish to engage in acts of invasion in the name of justice. In the world, there are various forms of justice, such as nations and religions, and the refusal to understand each other and the imposition of one's own justice on others is often the cause of many wars. I believe that if each individual thinks for themselves, respects each other instead of taking given justice at face value, and becomes friends, wars will decrease. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.